The man was bigger than me by 4 inches and 60 pounds, and he had been using those inches and pounds as a form of communication his entire life, which was a thing I understood by the time he shoved me, because I had been watching him for the 3 minutes it took the situation to arrive there. It started with a straw. Piper had been reaching for the straw dispenser at the coffee counter of the Pilot Flying J at the Corbin exit on Interstate 75. She was 8 years old and the counter was adult height, and she had leaned across at exactly the moment that the man, whose name I did not yet know was Dex Colton, had shifted his weight on the stool he was occupying at the end of the counter. Her elbow had caught the outside of his arm. Not hard, barely, the specific incidental contact of an 8-year-old and an adult in a truck stop at 9 in the evening. She had said sorry before I could say anything. She had said it immediately, in the specific polite reflex of a child who had been taught that acknowledgement was the correct response to accidental contact, and she had said it while already reaching for the straw she had been reaching for. Dex Colton had turned on his stool. He had looked at her and then at me, and he had said something about the straw and the reaching and the space that he was in. I am not going to repeat it verbatim because Piper was 8 years old and she was standing right there and she did not need those words to exist in her memory any more precisely than they already did. I had said, she apologized. He had turned the rest of the way on the stool. What followed was the specific escalation that certain people had perfected, the series of small steps that each looked like a response to what the other person had just done, and that were actually a predetermined sequence leading to a destination the escalating party had already decided on. He had been dismissive. He had been contemptuous. He had let his size become physical by degrees, moving from the stool into standing in a way that maximized how much of the space he occupied. I had said, "We're going to step back." He had said, "Are we?" He had put both hands on my chest and shoved, not hard enough to knock me down, hard enough to make the point that he could, which was the point he was making. I had deflected with my right hand, the specific automatic movement of someone who had spent years working in physically demanding environments and who had enough body sense to redirect force rather than absorb it. My right hand had come up and pushed his arms to the side, palm out, and for a moment my right hand was at shoulder height and visible, and the scar was visible. The scar that ran across the palm from the base of the index finger to the base of the thumb. The specific raised irregular scar of a wound that had been serious enough to require surgery, and that had healed the way significant wounds healed, which was incompletely and permanently. A voice behind Dex Colton said, "Cole Ryden." Not loud, the specific quiet of someone who did not need volume. Dex turned. A man stood 6 feet away. He was 68 years old and not large, average height, the build of someone who had been lean their whole life and who remained lean in the way of people who had never stopped working. He had white hair and the specific face of someone who had spent a long time being the person that certain situations required, which had produced in the face a quality of settled authority that was not performed and did not need to be. He was looking at my right hand. He said, still quietly, to Dex, "I know this man." Dex said nothing. The man said, "Nearly 6 years ago on that highway out there, at 1:45, this man pulled my son out of a burning car. He cut his hand open on the doorframe doing it. He spent the night in the hospital because of it." He looked at Dex with the specific look of someone who had spent 32 years looking at people and assessing situations and who had arrived at an assessment. He said, "You just put your hands on him in front of his little girl." The truck stop had the specific quality of a space that had organized itself around a moment. Dex Colton left. The man walked toward me. He put out his hand. His left hand, which was the hand available to shake when the right hand was the hand that told the story. He said, "Walt Pruitt. I was the Sheriff of Harlan County." I said, "I remember you." He said, "I thought you might." Piper said from beside me, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I knew the right people would show up." Let me tell you about the bridges before I tell you about the fire, because the bridges are where I spent 12 years of my life, and because the quality of attention that bridges required was the quality of attention that had made me stop on a highway in the dark when most people would not have stopped. I am a structural inspector for the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, not the engineers who design the structures. I am the person who comes after the design and after the building and who spends time with what was built to understand whether what was built is still what it should be. I look at bridge decks and superstructures and substructures and bearing assemblies and expansion joints and the specific accumulated consequences of traffic and weather and time on the things people drove over every day without thinking about what was underneath them. Most people did not think about what was underneath them. This was fine. What was underneath them did not require their attention as long as it had mine. I had come to this work through a civil engineering degree at the University of Kentucky, which was where my father had gone, and his father before him, the specific Lexington inheritance of blue and white that went back several generations, and that I had not questioned, and that had turned out to be the right choice for reasons that had nothing to do with inheritance. I had understood, in my first structures class, that buildings and bridges were the specific form of honesty that engineering could produce, that they either held what they were supposed to hold or they did not, and that the difference between holding and not holding was the specific quality of the attention that had gone into building and maintaining them. I had been with the Transportation Cabinet since 2013. 12 years of walking structures, of noting conditions, of writing reports that said what was true about the specific physical state of the infrastructure that made daily life in Kentucky possible. The work took me all over the state and into Tennessee, and into the specific hotel rooms and truck stops and early mornings on the shoulders of highways that constituted a traveling inspector's life. Piper had been born in 2017. She had come into a family with a father who traveled for work and a mother who was a pediatric occupational therapist in Lexington and who had built a practice around children who needed specific help with specific things, and who had brought to everything she did the specific quality of attention that her work required. Miriam had the quality that the best therapists had, which was that she could be with a child in the specific way the child needed to be with, rather than the way the therapist needed to be present. She followed rather than led. She received rather than directed. She met children where they were with the complete acceptance of someone who understood that where they were was where the work started. Piper had her mother's quality of attention. I had known this since Piper was 4 years old and had watched her observe a situation for 30 seconds before engaging, which was not a 4-year-old behavior, but was Piper's behavior and had been from the beginning. Miriam had died in August 2022 from Brugada syndrome, a rare cardiac condition in which the heart's electrical system misfired without warning in an otherwise healthy person, at a moment that gave no indication that anything was wrong. She had been 33 years old. She had been in the kitchen making coffee on a Tuesday morning. She had sat down on the kitchen floor and had not gotten up. Piper had been 5 years old. I had been in Owensboro, inspecting a bridge deck on the William H. Natcher Bridge over the Ohio River, when my phone had rung. I had been standing on a bridge when Miriam died. I'd thought about this many times in the 3 years since, the specific terrible arithmetic of it, of being on a structure that I was there to ensure held when the structure of my own life had failed. I had not found anything useful in the arithmetic. I had put it in the place where useless things went and had gotten on with what needed to be done, which was being Piper's father at the specific level that Piper needed her father to be. My mother, Donna, had been essential to this. She lived in Lexington, 20 minutes from our house, and she had become the specific daily presence that grandmothers became when the need was real. She watched Piper when I traveled, which was often, when she was not available, school holidays, her own trips, the specific gaps that occurred in every childcare arrangement. Piper came with me. She had been in the truck on this trip because Donna had a sister visiting from Louisville, and because Piper had had a teacher workday on Thursday, and because 3 days in Knoxville with her father, and a hotel with a pool and a truck stop on the way home, was, at 8 years old, an acceptable alternative to a week with Donna and Donna's sister, who was pleasant, but who did not know as much about bridges as Piper now did. Piper knew a significant amount about bridges. She had been coming on inspection trips since she was 6, had developed the specific vocabulary of structural assessment from 2 years of listening to her father work, and had opinions about suspension versus cable-stayed bridges that I had come to respect. I had been driving north on I-75 on the night of June 14, 2019, a Friday night, late, coming home from a bridge inspection job in Knoxville. I had been on the road since 7 in the evening. It was 11:30 when I hit the Corbin stretch. The Corbin stretch of I-75 was the specific stretch of interstate that highway inspectors noticed. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because the terrain did something there. The road curved through the hills in a way that changed the dynamic of nighttime driving, that took an attentive driver and required specific attentiveness rather than general attentiveness. I had been attentive. I always was, on a highway at night, because I had spent 12 years understanding what happened to structures that were not attended to. The vehicle ahead of me had lost control in the curve. It happened with the specific speed of highway accidents. Not slowly, not with the dramatic quality that movies gave to crashes, quickly and then completely. The SUV had been in the right lane, and then it had not been in a lane at all, and then it had been on the shoulder and rolling, and I had been braking with the specific controlled braking of someone who needed to stop but who could not stop faster than physics allowed. I had stopped on the shoulder behind the wreckage. The SUV was on its side against the guardrail, partially upright with smoke coming from the engine compartment. Not fire yet, the specific preliminary quality of smoke that preceded fire, the warning that the transition was coming and that the timeline for what needed to happen before it arrived was short. I had called 911. I had given the dispatcher the mile marker and the direction and the condition as I understood it in the first 30 seconds of assessing it, and then I had put the phone in my pocket and gone to the vehicle. The driver was alive. Unconscious, held by the seatbelt in the driver's seat, which had become a position that was neither upright nor sideways, pinned by the airbag that had deployed and partially deflated, and that was now a specific obstacle rather than the specific protection it had been designed to be. The window on the passenger side was broken. The roll had done that, and the window gave access to the interior. I had reached through the passenger window. The problem was the door. The driver's door, the door that would have allowed me to reach the driver directly, had been compromised by the roll. The frame had shifted, and the handle mechanism that would have released it was now in a position that required me to reach across the interior with my right arm while supporting my body weight with my left arm braced on the window frame. I had done this. The smoke had been building. The specific quality of the smoke was changing, the white preliminary smoke becoming something darker, something with more substance. I had gotten my right hand on the door handle mechanism and had pulled. The mechanism had a sheared edge, not visible, not something I had known was there until the pulling, the specific sharp edge of broken metal that was the result of the roll, and that was exactly where my hand was when I pulled with the force the pulling required. The cut was immediate and significant. Not the kind you noticed as pain at first, the kind you noticed as warmth and then as the specific awareness of having been opened in a way that was not supposed to happen. I had not stopped pulling. The door had released on the third pull. The young man had been accessible after that. I had supported him while the seatbelt was cut by the time he was accessible, I was aware that there were other people there, the specific arrival of other drivers who had stopped, and one of them had a knife and had cut the seatbelt, and together we had gotten the young man onto the grass of the shoulder. The smoke behind us had become fire. I had sat on the grass of the shoulder and looked at my right hand and understood what had happened to it. The paramedics had arrived 14 minutes after my call. They had taken the young man, taken him first, as they should, as I had needed them to, and then one of them had come to where I was sitting with my right hand wrapped in the shirt I had taken off, and had looked at the wound and had said I needed to come with them. I had gone with them. I had spent the night in the hospital in Corbin. In the morning, before I was discharged, a man I did not recognize had come to my room. He had been 62 years old. He had been dressed in the civilian clothes of someone who was not on duty, but who would always carry the quality of duty in how he carried himself. He had looked at the bandage on my right hand for a moment, and then he had looked at me. He had said, "My son told me what you did. I don't have words for it." I had said, "He's alive." That's the words. He had said, "Does it hurt?" I had said, "Some." He had said, "I'll remember that scar." He had shaken my left hand and walked out of the hospital room, and I had not seen him again for nearly 6 years. Walt Pruitt had been the Sheriff of Harlan County, Kentucky for 32 years. He had started in law enforcement at 24, had made deputy at 26, had run for sheriff at 30 and had won, and had continued winning every election for 3 decades, which was not because Harlan County lacked opinions about who should be sheriff, but because Walt Pruitt was the specific kind of public servant who was difficult to argue against. Not perfect, not without the specific errors that 32 years of decision-making produced, but consistently present and consistently honest, and consistently the person who showed up when showing up was what the situation required. He had retired in 2020, the year after Tommy's accident, at 63. His daughter lived in Knoxville. He visited her every few months, driving I-75 in both directions, passing the Corbin exit twice per trip. Every time he passed the Corbin exit, he thought about the night of June 14, 2019, and about the man whose name he had gotten from the hospital records and whom he had looked up and whom he had wanted to find. He had found my name on the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet's inspector roster. He had found my professional contact information. He had sat with the phone in his hand twice and had put it down both times. He had said, when I asked him in the truck stop booth why he had never called, because what I wanted to say wasn't a phone call. Some things need a face. I had said, say it now. He had looked at me from across the booth with the settled quality of 68 years of being exactly who he was. He had said, my son is alive. He is married to a woman he loves, and they have 2 children who are the specific wonder of children when they are entirely themselves and not yet aware of what the world might make of them. And Tommy is a paramedic. He has been a paramedic since 2021. He responds to highway accidents on I-75 and on the county roads of Harlan, and he does the work with the specific quality of someone who has been on the other side of it and who understands what the other side of it requires. He had paused. He had said, he told me once that he became a paramedic because of that night, not because of the accident, because of the man who stopped. I had looked at my right hand on the table between us. The scar was the specific color of healed tissue, lighter than the surrounding skin, slightly raised, the permanent topography of something that had happened and been resolved and that was resolved imperfectly in the way of all resolutions that involved the body. I had said, I didn't know his name. Walt had said, I know. I had said, I left the hospital the next morning. I asked if he was okay. They said stable. I drove home. Walt had said, I know, I asked the nurses. They told me you'd left before I got there. I had said, you got there the next morning. He had said, I drove through the night. I was in Harlan when they called me. 3 hours on the mountain roads. I had thought about that. Walt Pruitt driving 3 hours through the night on the mountain roads from Harlan to Corbin because his son was there. The specific urgency of that drive and the specific grief of arriving and finding the man who had pulled his son out gone already, driven home to Lexington, leaving only a name on a hospital intake form. I had said, I'm sorry I wasn't there. He had said, you had already done the thing that mattered. He had looked at me. He had said, you could have driven past. I had said, no, I couldn't. He had said, most people do. I had thought about this. I had thought about the specific question of whether I had made a choice on that shoulder, or whether the stopping had been the absence of a choice, the removal of the option to not stop, the specific quality of a person for whom certain things were not options. I had said, I don't think it was a decision. I think when the situation is in front of you and you have what you need to address it, the decision is already made. You either have what you need or you don't. Walt had said, what do you need? I had said, the willingness to be present for what's actually there, not what you wish was there. He had thought about this. He had said, that's what bridge inspection taught you. I had said, among other things. He had said, Tommy says the same thing about paramedic work. You have to see what's there, not what you expected to find. I had said, he'll be a good paramedic. Walt had said, he is a good paramedic. Piper had been in the adjacent booth throughout this conversation with her hot dog and her apple juice and her specific quality of being nearby without intruding, the quality she had from Miriam, the quality of someone who understood that certain conversations needed space and who provided the space without being asked. She had been listening. At some point in the conversation, she had finished her hot dog and had folded the wrapper neatly and had placed it at the edge of the table and had been sitting with her apple juice and her attention for the latter part of what Walt and I had said to each other. Walt had been in the middle of telling me about Tommy's youngest child. A girl, 2 years old, who Walt described with the specific helpless affection of a grandfather who had not expected to be as thoroughly undone by grandchildren as he had been. When Piper had said from the adjacent booth, "Excuse me," Walt had looked at her. She had said, "Are you Tommy's dad?" Walt had said, "Yes." She had said, "My dad doesn't talk about that night. He's never told me about it." Walt had said, "Is that so?" She had said, "He tells me about the bridges he fixes. He tells me about the inspections and what he finds and why it matters, but not about that." Walt had said, "Why do you think that is?" She had thought about this with the specific consideration she brought to questions that required actual thought rather than quick answers. She had said, "I think because fixing bridges is his job. You're supposed to do your job, but stopping for Tommy, that wasn't his job. That was just him being him." The truck stop was quiet around us the way places got quiet when something was said that was exactly right. Walt looked at me. I looked at my daughter. She was 8 years old, and she had been watching her father on the road since she was 6, and she had been listening to bridge stories for 2 years, and she had been in the truck stop when the man had shoved her father, and she had not cried and had not hidden and had done the emotional math correctly and had arrived at the answer. Walt said, "She's exactly right." I said, "I know." He said, "That's who you are, not what you do for work." I said, "Miriam used to say you couldn't separate them. What you do and who you are." She said people who thought they were different things were wrong. He said, "She sounds like she was wise." I said, "She was the wisest person I knew." He said, "What happened to her?" I told him. "The Brugada syndrome. The Tuesday morning in August. The kitchen floor. Being on the Natcher Bridge when the phone rang." He listened the way he had listened to everything. Completely, without the performative responses that people sometimes substituted for actual listening. When I finished, he said, "Piper was 5. I said, "Yes." He said, "She doesn't seem like a child who lost her mother at 5. I said, "She is. She just carries it the way Miriam would have carried it." He said, "Which is how?" I said, "Facing forward, paying attention, not letting the loss become the identity." He looked at Piper, who had gone back to her apple juice and had taken out a small notebook. She kept a notebook, had kept one since she was 7, for bridge observations and trip notes and the specific record of things she thought were worth keeping. She was writing something. Walt said, "What's she writing?" I said, "I'll find out later. She shows me after." He said, "She keeps notes." I said, "She's been doing it for a year. She got it from Miriam." He looked at Piper writing in the booth. He said, "Tommy's daughter does the same thing. She's 2. She scribbles, but she's serious about the scribbling." I said, "It starts with scribbling." He said, "Yes, it does." We left the truck stop at 10:15. Piper was in the back seat with her notebook and her jacket pulled up to her chin, and the specific quality of a child who was working through something internally and who would tell me about it when the working was done. The highway north was the highway I had driven hundreds of times. The specific intimacy of a road that you knew, the landmarks and the curves and the places where the bridges crossed and the quality of the pavement changed and the specific feeling of a road that was familiar without being routine. I thought about Tommy Pruitt responding to highway accidents on I-75 in a paramedic unit. I thought about the chain of it. The accident, the stopping, the pulling, the scar, the hospital night in Corbin, the nearly 6 years of Walt looking, the truck stop, Walt's voice saying my name from 6 feet away in the specific quiet that did not need volume. I thought about Dex Colton and what had happened in the truck stop and the specific ordinary cruelty of a man who used size as a form of authority and who had met, in a truck stop on I-75 in Corbin, Kentucky, the retired sheriff whose son was alive because of the man he was shoving. The highway did not know about any of this. The highway was what it was. The infrastructure, the pavement, and the bridges, and the guardrails, and the specific physical fact of a road that connected places and that people used without thinking about what it contained. I thought about Tommy on this road at night in June 2019, and about the curve and the guardrail and the fire. I thought about stopping. After a while, Piper said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I wrote about tonight." I said, "What did you write?" She said, I wrote that sometimes you're in a truck stop and a man is mean to your dad and you're scared, but then an old man shows up and he knows your dad from a long time ago, and it turns out your dad did something really good that you didn't know about, and it makes the mean man less scary because the good thing is bigger. I said, "That's a lot for a notebook." She said, "It fit." I said, "Piper?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "The man tonight, Dex, you weren't scared, were you? Not really?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "A little, for a second, before Mr. Pruitt." I said, "That's okay. A little scared for a second is the right amount for that situation." She said, "Mr. Pruitt was really calm." I said, 32 years of being a sheriff." She said, "He loves Tommy." I said, "Very much." She said, "And Tommy became a paramedic because of you." I said, "Because of that night." She said, "Because of you stopping." I did not say anything. She said, "Mom would have said those are the same thing." I looked at the highway ahead, the bridges over the small rivers, the guardrails, the mile markers, the specific physical fact of a road that I had spent 12 years understanding from the inside, and that was, tonight, simply the road home. I said, "Yes, she would have said those are the same thing." Piper wrote something else in the notebook. She closed it. She said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "That scar." I said, "Yes." She said, "I always wondered about it." I said, "I know. I should have told you." She said, "Now I know." I said, "Now you know." She said, "I'm glad you stopped." I said, "I couldn't have not stopped." She said, "I know. That's why I'm glad." She put her head against the window. In a few miles she was asleep. The highway went north through the Kentucky dark, through the hills and the bridges and the mile markers, toward Lexington, toward home, through the specific ordinary infrastructure of a state that I had spent 12 years understanding from the inside and that held, tonight, the way it was supposed to hold. That was enough. That had always been enough. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has there been a moment in your life when something you did, something you didn't think of as particularly remarkable, something that was simply what the situation required, turned out to have traveled further than you knew? You stopped. Someone else kept going because you did. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.